Water lines in Detroit are breaking in the winter's cold, yet it's the water lines in Flint, Michigan that are being replaced. The endless and wasteful aftermath of the Flint Water Crisis today on The 10th Man. Water mains in Detroit are breaking as the winter cold takes its toll. It happens every year. Pipes burst, streets flood, and taxpayers foot the bill. Yet just a few miles north in Flint, millions of dollars are being spent to replace water lines that are perfectly fine. What connects Detroit's broken infrastructure to Flint's wasteful repairs? The answer lies in greed, corruption, and political dysfunction. The Flint Water Crisis wasn't just a tragedy, it was a cautionary tale of how power and politics can turn manageable problems into national disasters. Today on The 10th Man, we'll uncover the truth about Flint and Detroit, how two struggling cities became entangled in one another's failures, and why the pursuit of justice has been so one-sided. Detroit's infrastructure is crumbling under the weight of decades of neglect. Ancient water mains, some over a century old, snap under the pressure of frozen soil. Repairs are slow and costly, with no end in sight. In January 2025, 10 water mains broke simultaneously. In February, a 54-inch water main broke, flooding hundreds of homes and locking out residents due to freezing and loss of power. Meanwhile, Flint has become a hub of activity as crews dig up water lines in neighborhoods across the city. But here's the twist. Those pipes don't need replacement. The lead contamination that sparked the Flint Water Crisis was caused by improper water treatment, not faulty pipes, so why the frenzy? If you want to understand this, you must go back to Detroit's bankruptcy. Also to Flint's financial struggles and the tangled web of political greed that brought two cities together. Detroit went bankrupt. That was in 2013. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in the U.S. ever. Once the wealthiest city in America, it was turned over to the Democrats, and they quickly went bankrupt. You may remember Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick. He was the last mayor before the bankruptcy. He's noteworthy because he went to prison for real crimes, not lawfare. He was convicted of 24 felonies, actual felonies like mail fraud and racketeering. He used his city credit card to buy a new Lincoln Navigator and then had to close the zoo and the aquarium to pay the bills. And his term as mayor was marked by big parties at the mayoral mansion and even the murder of an exotic dancer, which is controversial and still unsolved. Now, city bankruptcies like the one that took place in Detroit are not common. There have only been 60 since the Great Depression. And Detroit's was the largest in terms of the monetary value. During the bankruptcy, Detroit had an emergency manager assigned by the state. All Michigan cities with emergency managers assigned have the same things in common. They're all Democrat, they're majority black, but most important, they all have a city income tax. This last one is the most important because it shows an attitude of trying to tax others to support yourself. That's a common Democrat trait. The Democrat politician is always looking around, and whenever he sees some money that people have accrued to provide for some need, he tries to figure out how he can get his hands on it. Or in this case, when he sees a bunch of people who are working hard, he tries to figure out a way to tax them by not causing taxes to go up for his own constituents. As Detroit shrank and Detroiters left the community, so left the tax base. The Democrats were free then to proclaim the people still commuting back to the city to work as parasites. To the Democrats, there are just more sheep to be sheared. Democrats are very creative in the taxes they conceived. There's not just a city income tax. They were even talking about taxing people if the company where they worked had a parking lot. If they were able to park for free, the city was going to call that imputed income and tax you on your parking space. There's no mass transit, you have to drive to work, and then the city wanted to tax you for parking. Now, these commuters are working. They're driving the economy. They would love to live in Detroit if it wasn't a dangerous, dying city. So the city calls them parasites and says they need to pay taxes to support the police and the roads, even though the police back then were corrupt and ineffective. The roads are poor and already being supported by Michigan's high gasoline taxes. So if you want to find a city that's failing, just look for a city income tax. And of course, another failing city with an income tax is Flint, Michigan. We'll talk about them in a moment, but we're going to take a quick break and talk about the word of the day, or in this case, a phrase. The mainstream media uses and abuses a lot of phrases, like the phrase extreme weather, for example. Normal winter temperatures, such as the ones causing the water line breaks in Detroit, are now called extreme weather to promote the climate change agenda. And that phrase has therefore become meaningless. We give you that example as one that's obvious, so here's another one. We all know what an ad hominem is. It's when you run out of arguments, so you call people names like racist or stupid, white nationalist, etc. But we are now hearing today what is the weakest, lamest ad hominem ever used. It's on the news every single day and every single hour of the day. How bad would you feel if someone insulted you by calling you listener discretion is advised, an unelected billionaire? Isn't that the weakest ad hominem you've ever heard? This is what the Democrats have fallen back on regarding Elon Musk. They cannot find fault with any of his efforts, so they just call him names, an unelected billionaire. Unelected? There are only two people in the entire country who are elected by the entire country, the president and vice president. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are the only two people in the world who are elected by the American public. Calling anybody unelected all by itself is the weakest ad hominem possible. And none of those federal judges tossing injunctions onto the conveyor belt of lawfare was elected. All were appointed by presidents, as was Elon Musk. And billionaire? How is that an insult? It's at best neutral because billionaires get that way due to a combination of merit and luck, and it seems anybody would be lucky to have a billionaire working for him for free. And that's what we Americans have today. But if there's one sentence that says it all about the Democrats, it's this. 4 people who are despised by the Democrats are Donald Trump, Elon Musk, RFK Jr., and Tulsi Gabbard, who all have one thing in common. All 4 used to be Democrats, and the Democrats loved them back then. The two cities of Flint and Detroit have much more in common than just their politics. The two cities are joined by their water systems quite literally and physically. But contrary to what you might think and all you've been told, the Flint crisis was not caused by switching their water supply from Detroit to the Flint River. Cities all across America use river water. The news media were in a panic saying they're not using Great Lakes water anymore. Well, look at a map. How far are you from the Great Lakes? You're probably not using lake water either. If you're not in the Great Lakes Basin and have city water, then you're on river water too. Yes, there are millions of people who are using Great Lakes water for their drinking water supply, but not all, or even most. And we'll talk about the corrosion in a minute, but if you want to know some real corrosive water, go to Brownsville, Texas back in the 1990s. In Brownsville, Texas, their Rio Grande water is sufficiently corrosive that people were coming home to find wet spots on their walls due to pinhole leaks. The water etched its way through the copper tubing. Builders had cut corners and used tubing with thinner walls, and people had to replace all the plumbing in their houses because over time the water ate right through it. Now that's corrosive. But it wasn't corrosiveness that created the lead contamination. And the Flint crisis was not caused by switching their water supply to the Flint River because, in fact, many cities have used river water, and that includes the city of Flint. Flint's water supply was the Flint River up until 1971. In 1971, they switched to buying their water from Detroit, and that's because, believe it or not, in the 1970s, the city of Flint was growing. And they were concerned not about water quality, but water quantity. They were concerned about the capacity of their plant and the ability of the river to supply a growing city. Now ask yourself, what would be so magical about Detroit water? In fact, it's also drawn from a river, the Detroit River, and it's actually the same water. Flint River water flows into Lake Huron, which flows into the Detroit River. It's the same water. So somehow letting it flow to Detroit so that it can be treated there and then pumped back to Flint where it has to be lifted 400 feet in elevation in the process at the same time, that's a good idea? Of course it's not a good idea. The water started out in Flint. How much electricity was consumed pumping that water up to Flint? How much coal-fired electricity was used? What about the harm to the climate? When the story broke, people also started talking about all the pollution in the river. Well, the Flint River is not polluted, not since the Clean Water Act of the 1960s. The problem with the river water is it has a low pH, not high pollution. Actually, the water doesn't even come from the Flint River per se, it actually comes from the Holloway Reservoir, which is a beautiful, man-made lake far upstream from Flint. There's even a Flint River Watershed Coalition that promotes canoeing, fishing, and other outdoor activities on the lake, the river, and all its tributaries. The dam that impounds the reservoir has a spillway with a little waterfall, stepping stone falls. It's all quite nice. And those tributaries to the Flint River include designated trout streams, such as one near my house. All sounds quite lovely, doesn't it? Quite unlike the pictures that they show you of the Flint River downtown with bicycles and shopping carts in the water. Of course, that's not where they get their drinking water. They get it from the reservoir. And the water that we sent to Flint was just fine. Sorry, Flint, if you didn't take care of it. I hope you're finding this episode informative. If so, please tell a friend. The channel thrives on word of mouth, and we need your help. Remember, this is the only commercial you'll ever hear, so please pass the word. In 2011, both Flint and Detroit were broke. Emergency managers were appointed by the state, and one reason Detroit was broke is because its residents didn't pay their water bills. The people of Detroit say, water is a human right, which is all you have to say when you're a Democrat. So what did the city of Detroit do about those unpaid bills? Well, what do Democrats always do? They look around for somebody else with money. The city of Detroit was supplying Flint with water. In fact, Flint was its biggest water customer. So Detroit demanded payment from Flint and kept raising their rates because a city has to pay. The Democrats in Detroit saw Flint as a goose to be plucked. And turning the screws on the mostly black citizens of Flint was easier than squeezing the money out of their own residents. But we have to be fair to Detroit, it's not all their fault. When they do try to shut off water to people who don't pay, they face lawsuits. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, has been suing Detroit continuously since 2014. They're suing Detroit today for expecting people to pay their water bill or face a water shutoff. Well, isn't it pretty clear that Flint and its suburbs can't carry the burden of Detroit's water bill? Feeling that pinch, Flint joined a cooperative to create a new water system, bringing water to various communities from Lake Huron, and this would be cheaper, more efficient. This is when it turned ugly, or maybe uglier. The city of Detroit, fearful that it was losing its cash cow, now acted like a jilted lover. Detroit told Flint, "No, you cannot leave. You cannot join the Caragnandi water project. You have to buy our overpriced water." And Flint said to Detroit, "Sorry, but it's over. We have found another partner." So then, Detroit invoked a clause in their contract with Flint and told them if they did not withdraw from the Caragnandi water project, Detroit would cut them off in a year's time. Do you understand how serious this is? And how nobody talks about it? It was in all the papers. Detroit said, "No water for you, Flint." And none of the Democrats, none of the news media, not the ACLU, what about water is a human right? None of them has ever said a word about this. And Detroit legally cut off thousands of customers who were paying. So Flint was in a bind because the water project cooperative would not be delivering water for 18 months, as everybody knew. So, striking back, the Flint City Council told Detroit, "Well, we're not going to give you that extra year. We're going to cut you off right now." So many intelligent moves by intelligent people, right? So many ways to fix the problem, but Democrat egos were in the way. Now, Flint had always known that they could just switch back to the Flint River supply, and they decided to do just that. Well, they couldn't just decide themselves. Remember, they were under an emergency manager appointed by the state, and they had to get his permission first. This is another major point that goes unstated or is lied about only because the emergency manager was a Republican. The state government was Republican at the time. It's been mostly Democrat since. But because this emergency manager was appointed by the Republican governor, he is blamed for the Flint water crisis. He's blamed despite the fact that he actually put the brakes on the transfer. Yes, he stopped it. Since the state of Michigan was also managing the bankruptcy of Detroit, the emergency manager of Flint took into account that the loss of revenue from the Flint water would have a negative impact on Detroit. So the emergency manager did not just sign off on the cutover. First, he had the state do a study. After that study determined that Detroit should be able to manage without the revenue from Flint, or that they were going to lose it in 18 months anyway, only then did he grant permission. Emergency manager Darnell Early did not create the Flint water crisis. He granted the request of the city of Flint to create the Flint water crisis. The media reported that Early did it to save money. People talk as if he forced Flint to do it, but on the contrary, once Early granted permission, the city council members formed a conga line and marched around city council chambers singing "We Shall Overcome." When they performed the cutover, they had a big ceremony where they had a toast to each other, drinking the new water that they supplied themselves from the Flint River. It was not the state of Michigan that caused the cutover from Detroit water to Flint River water. Everything would have been fine after that in most cities. The water plant worked before, it could work again. And if the government had simply done its job, there'd be no story here. But incompetence in Democrat-run cities is the norm. And for the first and only time in American history, the water department became the vehicle of deliberately poisoning citizens. We'll look at the aftermath in part 2. But first, a special presentation. As the third anniversary of the Ukraine invasion unfolds, history echoes louder than ever. In the next episode, we give a special presentation exploring the striking parallels between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and America's war in Vietnam. Two conflicts fueled by historical divisions, global politics, and the weight of foreign intervention. So next you're going to hear about Ukraine and Vietnam, and then back to the Flint Water Crisis. Now tell a friend about the 10th Man podcast, and thank you for listening.